Hello aviators! After my previous video about playing DCS in 1440p and reasonable quality at 60Hz, at least most of the time, I decided to compare the performance on each DCS map I own. To be concrete, besides the three Caucasus and Marianas, I've got Nevada or NTTR, Persian Gulf, Syria, the Channel, Normandy, Kola and the latest Germany. That means 4 maps are missing: Sinai, Afghanistan, Iraq and South Atlantic. When I talk about performance, it's not only about FPS but also how much video RAM and system RAM is used while playing those maps. Of course, those numbers will not be absolutely scientific and the usage varies even when doing the same thing, but I was interested in big picture patterns during real-life usage, and there are some. This video has 3 main sections. First, I'll talk about the method and reasoning, then we'll go over the data for the maps and rank the maps' performance in various categories. And finally, we will talk about the DCS system options that can affect performance, especially in order to make the worst-case performance situations a little bit better. As mentioned in the previous video, I made a situational and impulsive purchase of NVIDIA RTX 5060 Ti, 16GB of course, which allowed me to play with better graphics settings. My aim is 60 FPS VSync gaming, and I get it in most cases. But of course, if I go to Marianas or the latest Cold War Germany map, I'll see lower numbers, even under 40. Is it a deal breaker? Not necessarily, but we'll go over it in the last third of this video. The method used to compare the maps is quite straightforward. Every DCS player knows from experience that low-level and high-level flying are 2 different experiences. Everybody likely expects that low-level performance is worse, and there will be no surprises here. I decided for one flight at 1000 meters, mostly in a straight line, and one very low-level flight just above the trees or buildings, preferably in an area with a lot of details. During the 1000-meter flight, each minute I took a 40-second sample of FPS statistics, which gave me more info than just making one multi-minute measurement. This way I got FPS average for various situations, for instance interval over Berlin and later another one over a less populated area. That's the meaning of FPS average min and max in some charts later. For low-level flight, where the view changes much faster, I went for 30 seconds periods and measured 20 seconds during each. So it's the same method, just double the speed. The test missions are otherwise empty. Obviously the real-life performance in real-life missions will be only worse because of the additional units, triggers, explosions and so on. But I wanted to see only the effect of the maps, nothing else. I tested with 2 quality settings, the difference being only the detail sliders. They were all either 100% up, this is called Q 100%, or in the middle, Q 50%. I expected bigger differences between those settings, especially during the low-level flight, and I was a bit disappointed. But there are some differences and you will see it in the charts. However, I decided to test other quality settings as well, but this time mainly on the Germany map, because that's where I wanted to see the impact during the lowest FPS scenarios. All the recording is done during the track replay for the best repeatability of the flight with various quality settings. You may ask, what is the overhead of track replay and OBS recording? And the answer is that the track replay has virtually the same performance as the original gameplay. OBS recording, which was important for me to go over the data for each interval during the flight, causes a noticeable FPS drop. For instance, on the test flight on the Germany map I got around 94% of the FPS compared to no recording, less than 6% FPS dip, so there is an impact, but I made all the tests the same way. It seems that the FPS drop of the recording is more or less constant, around 4 FPS. This means the overhead makes worst cases, low FPS maps, even worse when it comes to percentages, because the same constant drop results in a higher percentage drop. But the same will happen when playing real-life missions with additional objects. The same overhead will be more noticeable on the maps with lower performance. All the tests are flown with the same plane, L39C Albatros, without the gun sight, with no head tracking, the same forward view with the FOV of around 105 degrees. Let's talk about the graphics settings. I used DLSS quality for all the tests because that's how I play, but you could imagine that different GPU of, for instance, from AMD would play totally differently. Also, you could see different results in VR, I play on the monitor, or during various missions, but the point is I measured and compared the maps with my settings. Of course that concrete FPS numbers will differ with various setups, but I would not expect significant changes when it comes to the ratios or even overall order of the maps. You can get different results when testing different situations, and this would probably cause a bigger variability than the GPU and my settings will. As you can see, the settings are quite generous, especially when it comes to the textures, visibility clouds, water and the detail sliders. This is for the settings called Q100% in the tests. Q50% only differs in those 4 sliders, there is no other difference. Later I also played with visibility, water, clouds and shadows, but that's a topic for the last section of this video. Let's talk about the test cases, what was tested where. In most cases I tried to overfly one of the more demanding parts of the map and then perhaps mix in some less demanding surroundings as well. For Caucasus we fly high over Tbilisi and then some. The test flight took nearly 9 minutes for 9 intervals, each 40 seconds long, as previously discussed. For low-level flight I chose one partially forested valley close to Batumi, because it was actually much more demanding than Caucasus towns, which are arguably pretty poor when it comes to details. There were 5 measured intervals, 20 seconds each. For NTTR, I did both tests over Vegas. The high test has 9 intervals starting close to the Hoover Dam, and low flight is 5 intervals long all over Las Vegas. The Persian Gulf focuses on Dubai. I checked other areas, for instance Shiraz in Iran, but Dubai is the best stress test. 7 high and 6 low intervals. With Syria, the high flight is over Damascus, 7 intervals, and the low flight is in Adana, 6 intervals. For the channel I flew high over London, of course heading into the map, not outside, 7 intervals. The low test was done in Dunkirk, just 4 intervals because the later part of the track was way too easy on FPS and would skew the results too much. The Normandy map naturally focuses on London and Paris. I went high over London again for 9 intervals and low over Paris for 7 intervals. Kola is not so densely populated and neither it has so demanding forests. I'm actually a bit disappointed with the trees here, but that's off topic. I flew high over Kola Bay, that is Severomorsk and Murmansk, for 6 intervals or minutes. For low-level flight I tested in Murmansk, also 6 intervals, that is around 3 minutes. For Marianas there is not much choice. Guam was used for both tests. I needed to turn a few times for 7 high altitude intervals and 10 low level ones, which included the landing at the Andersen Air Force Base. And finally, for the Cold War Germany, I stressed it over Berlin, but there are some less demanding parts as well. For instance, the high flight is over 9 intervals and the later part is past Berlin. The low level flight is 7 intervals long. So let's look at the results. Mind you, these are the results made with the DCS version 2.9.159599.1 from the 5th of May 2025. Starting with the FPS average and 1% lows, let's look at the 1000 meter high flight. And there are no surprises here. Caucasus is at the top and Marianas and Germany are at the bottom. And you can see that mostly the maps scale from 150 to 100 FPS. And then suddenly Marianas in Germany are much slower. Typically Q50% results are better than Q100, but there are some minor discrepancies here like Nevada or Syria, but these results are very close anyway. It seems that Kola 50 is faster than Kola 100, but it's just because the whole field is so tight. The situation for the average FPS for low-level flight are roughly the same. Of course, FPS is lower overall, but the order is, you have typical things like Marianas in Germany at the bottom, but the top is more mixed up, especially because Q50 numbers now went up compared to the Q100. For instance, Caucasus is suddenly, with full quality, is suddenly in the middle of the pack. That's because the trees are really demanding, and when you lower the quality sliders, it helps a lot. That's why the Q50 Caucasus is at the top. I could also get a 5-kilometer altitude data, but I assumed it wouldn't be much different from a 1000 meter flight, and I've already got too many numbers anyway. It's not easy to make sense of it, that's why I went for 2 basic cases, low and high, and it clearly shows there are different numbers for each. The following charts show the same main FPS average number, but instead of being accompanied by the 1% low FPS, they are accompanied by the FPS average number for the best and worst intervals. The charts look interesting but also quite messy because there are really a lot of numbers. Perhaps the min-max difference from average says more about the individual test cases than about the maps, but in the end the lowest number really says something. It's what you can expect in the worst cases. So let's zoom at this number. The worst interval FPS average is something you can expect to encounter, especially during the low-level flight. When it comes to the worst FPS average interval for 1000-meter flight, the main observation for me was that it was all above 60 FPS, which is good. The difference from the long-term FPS average is not so large in most cases. Germany is actually also quite good, because the worst number is over Berlin with lots of details, so it's understandable. Talking about low level, that's another story, because that's when you get more limited by this number. It doesn't have to be only right at the treetop level, it can be at any altitude up to around 100 meters or so. Surprisingly, the Persian Gulf topped the chart here. This doesn't mean you can't find an interval that would be worse than the Caucasus, but as we've seen before, Persian Gulf is often just a bit slower, so it's not a big surprise after all. For the Caucasus, there is quite a big difference when the quality is tweaked, and Q50 helps a lot here. Let's try to put both high and low flying scenarios into a single chart now. This will smudge some of the details, but it should still make the general ranking of the maps pretty obvious. In this chart, the FPS average is the average of both cases, which is a bit of a crude number when we consider that I used a different number of intervals for various test tracks, but it's still a number somewhere between the high and low FPS average for each map. As for the FPS average for the worst and best intervals, quite predictably the intervals with the lowest FPS average are all from the low flight test. Surprisingly though, for the max FPS average interval I got higher numbers from low-level flight for Marianas, but this may be caused by the final landing section at Andersen. And if you just fly between the islands there, you could get even higher FPS average, of course. And the verdict is obvious. The map order is more or less as expected. The Caucasus, Nevada, the Persian Gulf, and then it gets a bit messy depending on the quality. So let's follow Q 100% here. This will give you Syria next, then Channel, Kola and Normandy, and this order is likely what you can expect in the typical DCS experience as well. And at the bottom of my not quite complete list of maps are obvious candidates, Marianas and the Germany map. Q 50% mixed numbers are here. The bars seem to be shorter, but the scale is different, so the numbers are actually higher, don't worry about it. We will see if the Germany map is optimized further, but even if it is just so behind Marianas, at least it has a reason to be there, with all the landmass and details. If you're interested in what you'll get with Q 50% on each map, this is the chart for you. But because this is a mixed graph, it shows lower numbers than what you would get for the worst cases, where you would get higher gain with a lower quality, of course. But soon we'll talk about more options as well to get higher FPS for maps like Germany, where it's needed most. Surely you could guess the rough order of the maps, but now I can say based on these numbers that Germany has half the performance of the Caucasus. Scrap the green numbers, best cases are for babies, but for FPS average and worst interval average, it's like I said. This is even more obvious if we just put all the FPS average numbers, that is for both low and high level flights and for both qualities, into a single number for each map. And because the FPS average number doesn't say anything now, let's just put it all into percentages. It clearly shows what we said before. Let's move away from FPS now. We will see how much VRAM and RAM is typically consumed while playing the various maps. The following numbers should be taken with a grain of salt, as I loaded the tracks for various maps in ad hoc order, but at the same time the process was quite randomized over a few days, so there should be no surprises when the charts show that the Germany map eats more VRAM than the Caucasus. As you can see on this low-level flight chart, Nevada 100% is much lighter on VRAM than Q50, which is probably an error in measurement. But you can see that the charts look more or less the same for both low and high-level flights. And also we can see that the VRAM usage is roughly the same whether you're low-level or high-level. Remember, this is average number over multiple intervals, so yes, the VRAM can go up and down, but this is the average for the maps and my tests. Again, the point is the big picture. Yes, Germany and Marianas are down there, with tons of details taking the toll, and more or less correlating with the FPS data. To wrap up the VRAM usage, it seems 12 GB would be just fine for DCS, while 8 GB is on the limit, unless you want to compromise on texture quality and so on. If you have the VRAM, always use better textures, as these are often the most efficient way to make the game look better, with everything else being equal, such as effects, level of details and so on. Don't let the process VRAM usage fool you. Just because DCS reports this and that number, which pretty much tracks this second VRAM number in the overlay, it doesn't mean that's all DCS requires. Used VRAM merely starts there, and layers under the game, such as drivers, need more and more VRAM as a result of what DCS is doing, so just focusing on the smaller number doesn't tell you anything, really. Surprisingly, in RAM usage, the Marianas is suddenly much lighter, and again, don't ask me why Q100% looks less RAM hungry than Q50. The reason likely is that in the end, Marianas map doesn't have so many objects in total, and that's what makes it surprisingly easier on RAM. On the other hand, Syria and Germany are all the way down there, likely because a lot of stuff needs to be in RAM, just because maps are so dense and detailed. I can only assume this could vary with the visibility range and preload radius and so on. My visibility range is set to Ultra, which is the second highest option. Talking about RAM, actually quite recently I had to upgrade from 32 gigs to 64 GB of RAM. Not because of Java development or running multiple virtual machines or playing family Dota game with DaVinci Resolve in the background, but mainly because of DCS hitting the RAM limitations quite regularly. At moments like that, the whole game changed to a starter fast and I had to restart DCS to get some playtime again. And by the way, no changing the size of a page file or even removing it didn't help. I thought 64 gigs will be enough for a long time, but you can see that Germany takes regularly 40 plus gigabytes, and recently I joined some online Germany map and that was quite crazy. The mission was heavy and I saw even 60 gigabytes taken. So DCS obviously can eat all the RAM you throw at it, but so far I didn't hit the limit and my experience is stutter-free. As another side note, during all tests I had the Firefox browser running, of course OBS to capture the video and Total Commander file manager. My baseline RAM usage is around 6 to 8 gigabytes even when I close all the apps, depending on stuff like Steam, Discord and so on. Each small app now eats hundreds of megabytes, that's the time we live in. Let's look at another metric. I appreciate when my GPU doesn't work at 100% power, so it stays reasonably quiet. With no VSync and no FPS cap, the GPU worked as hard as it could, of course, but it still wasn't the same power draw during all the test cases. Neither was it necessarily more power for harder scenes with less FPS. Typically the GPU uses more power to render more FPS, not when it struggles and renders less frames. But honestly, this chart hardly tells you anything. The envelope designation in this chart means that it's an average of the maximum GPU power number from each interval, more or less. The power draw is more interesting with FPS cap and VSync on, where generally you can see less power for easier maps, but this all depends on all the other objects in the view and so on. This is demonstrated in the footage from my previous video and I'm not going to repeat all the tests with FPS cap and VSync. There is one more test result I decided to prepare and it was quite a surprising one for me. I've noticed some posts on the DCS forums talking about the F10 map as a big VRAM hog, so I got curious. What about the Mission Editor? And what about running missions from it? I went over all my maps in the Mission Editor, always try to get a bit crazy with the zoom in and scrolling to get high numbers. Normally you may not get so high because the Mission Editor seems to release some memory eventually, which is good. But these are the numbers and ranking of the maps in the Mission Editor. Compared to the baseline of DCS after start, even the easiest map, which is Caucasus, takes a lot more resources in the Mission Editor. And then it more or less copies the ranking of maps as we know it by now, except for Marianas, which is on the easier side. Another interesting factor is the RAM usage, which is much higher, relatively speaking, for Syria and Germany map compared to the others. This may be because of the size of the maps, amount of objects, and partially it can also be a deviation in my tests, but I don't believe it's only that. The numbers are obviously higher. With 3 maps, I also managed to break 12 GB VRAM barrier, so perhaps it's not a bad idea to have 16 GB card. Finally, I decided to start an empty mission just for some free camera flying around. Here I have the capture from the Germany map, which is the most RAM-hungry map in our dataset. During my track replays, it took only 47 GB of RAM, but here you can see it went all the way up to 55 GB. With just 32 GB of RAM, it would be much more stressed to release some parts of it sooner, or it would simply stutter. And that's it for the relative map comparison results. But I've got a bit more. I focused on the Germany map in order to find the settings that would get me closer to 60 FPS even for those bad cases. I wouldn't mind 50 FPS here and there, but going under 40 is not attractive anymore. Let's start with the familiar high and low level flight tests for the Caucasus as the easiest map and Germany as the most demanding one. We've already seen the numbers for Q100 and Q50, now let's try to relax more settings. Q50% double star means that in addition to the quality sliders, I also lowered shadows, clouds and water quality one step down. Obviously the water will be the least of our problems as I've flown over the land most of the time, but we can see something is going on here. With the relaxed quality, we've got nearly the original Q100% performance of the high-level flight. Granted, quality is lowered, but the aim is to get a reasonable minimum FPS, and this works also for Germany. With this in mind, let's dive deeper into those settings and try them in isolation and in some combinations as well. For this, I decided to test it on the single 20-second interval over the trees here in Germany, because that was the worst interval for me. Plenty of data points here, and Q100% original will be our baseline. What the original means is the shadows high, Visib range ultra, which is the second highest setting, and this one also requires DCS restart when changed. Clouds on ultra and water on high. These are all the highest settings for these parameters. And as you can see, I've got 35 FPS for low-level flight over trees, which is not satisfactory. So what can we do about it? And right off the bat, shadows medium, just a single change of shadows from high to medium, which is the second highest option there, will give us 62 FPS instead of 35. That's a crazy improvement. Let's go back to this chart for a while, and you can see that even with many more compromises like quality sliders and including shadows medium, I didn't get such an improvement, but that's because these are long-term averages over many intervals. But now we are focusing on the worst interval. When we check clouds high, which is one notch down from the clouds ultra, it's not such an improvement, but again, shadows medium improve it a lot. When it comes to visibility range, when you lower that one, you will get much worse visual quality, and I will talk about it later. But again, it doesn't help so much. So none of this helps so much as the shadows medium setting. So lowering the shadows quality really helps, and you can see it on every single data point here. Shadows quality is the crucial factor for the worst case performance. But how does it affect the visual quality? When you are up high, it doesn't change much on the ground. When you are low, then are you able to see the difference when everything is zooming by very fast? It also affects quality of the shadows in the cockpit, and that's probably what you see most of the time in your view, so it can be important for you, but I would rather play with satisfactory FPS than with super sharp shadows in the cockpit, so I'll stick with this blurriness. You can see that for this low-level flight, worst-case scenario, Q50 will give you some lift up, but it's nowhere near to that shadows medium alone. So I would rather switch that one than lower the other quality. That actually affects how the things look outside. This is also demonstrated by this last line, where we lowered the quality sliders to 25% with shadow medium, and you can see that instead of 66 FPS, you got 69. Here is the same data as percents, so you can see that just shadows medium alone will give you 77%, and tweaking other stuff will give you just a few more percents after that. So shadows medium really is a compromise I'm willing to make. With all this information, I decided to go for the last scenario where I kind of mix it all up in a single dive towards Berlin. It takes around 80 seconds and it's just one interval, and the data is here. So this is the raw data with FPS average and FPS 1% low, and it hardly changes from case to case, even with shadow medium compared to shadow high. I also incorporated the numbers from the actual gameplay and the track replay here. As you can see, there's hardly any difference, and the track replay with OBS recording is just slightly slower. But the rest is pretty disappointing here. With shadows medium we didn't get more FPS or much more FPS as we've seen before when we were flying low level. The reason is that in this scenario we don't fly low over land for such a long time, and the rest of the scenario skews the average results. The percentages for FPS average show the same thing. The only outlier here is when you go from visibility ultra to extreme, you will lose 7% of FPS, but it's worth it, as I will show very soon. I also tried to read out minimum and maximum FPS during the whole 80 seconds interval, and this chart shows us that there is something that the shadows medium give you, and it's the higher number of these yellow lines, which is the minimum FPS. But again, this scenario wasn't as bad as that low flight just over the treetops, so it's not so obvious here. So do I even have some recommendations for you? Let's start with the options, and here you probably have to find the worst case scenario that is bothering you and then try to find the option that fixes it. And then decide whether you want to stick with it and compromise the visual quality, maybe it's not such a bad thing, or not. The other thing is that if your performance is really bad and you see a lot of stutters, check your task manager and the system performance there. Maybe you're running out of RAM. That's what happened to me. Another question is, are you willing to change system options when you go from map to map? I'm not, and that's why I stick with options that work very good or reasonably good also for things like Marianas and Germany. And what did I learn from this whole experiment, and what are my current options? As a low-level pilot, or mostly helicopter pilot, I decided to stick with those shadows medium, because while the difference is visible, it's not that important for me. Obviously, I use VSync and 60 FPS cap, as I already mentioned, and I also lowered the forest details factor to 0.8. It's a slight change, but it gives me a few more FPS in the worst cases. And finally, counterintuitively, I actually went for the extreme visibility range, and the reason is this. If you compare these two pictures, you can clearly see that on some maps the extreme visibility doesn't mean that you see things only that are very far away, but also that some detail things are shown even when they are quite close or reasonable, not so far away. You can, for instance, see this small tower here, that it is much smaller on the visibility range Ultra compared to the visibility range Extreme. And I actually don't like this growing stuff, which seems to be Ugra Media thing. I've seen something similar on a Syria map with ships, with civilian ships, and things on other maps can behave differently depending on the technology. But the thing is, I decided to reinvest my FPS gains from Shadows Medium into this extreme visibility. And so far I'm satisfied. Of course, anything can change in the future. And before I say goodbye, there is another update, 2.9.16, and that's just because I produced this video for like over many weeks. That's my bad. And Ugra Media came with some updates to Cold War Germany. Obviously it's a fresh map, so it's expected. Some reduced amount of usage of RAM and VRAM, but I quickly retested those Q100% scenarios for high flight, low flight, and the dive scenario we've seen at the end of the video, and I've seen no difference. I mean, there was some difference. Sometimes some FPSs were worse, some FPSs were better, RAM was sometimes better, sometimes worse, but in the end there was nothing significant. So nothing changes on this video. Of course, everybody expects that Ugra Media will make this map better and faster in the future, so it should not get worse, at least. And still, as I said, for the level of detail, it's perfectly acceptable. And with this out of the way, I hope you will return to one of my future videos, which will come very, I don't know when, of course. And with that, fly safe and see you later.